Welcome to another edition of Coffee Break with Paolo. I'm Paolo von Schirach, your host and president of the Global Policy Institute. This podcast is brought to you by Bay Atlantic University, located in downtown Washington, D.C., just 2 blocks from the White House. This series is produced by Switch and Board in Washington, D.C. Today, we are talking about Europe. There are important changes regarding top leadership position within the European Union, but there are also many challenges, ranging from Brexit to low economic growth in Europe to migration waves and a lot more. To discuss all this, we have with us Zsofia Racz. She is Hungarian and an analyst with the Budapest-based Center for Fundamental Rights. Zsofia, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you for having me, Paolo.
Well, let's start from the beginning. Tell us about where you work. Tell us about the center, what it does, what its objectives are, and I'm sure this will be a good lead to our chat.
Sure, absolutely. So the Center for Fundamental Rights is quite a new think tank back in Hungary, in Budapest. We were established in 2012, and ever since, what we have been doing is producing legal and political analysis on issues that concern European laws, European politics, and our own national laws and politics. So what we do is mainly producing policy papers and analysis on the ongoing situation in the world.
Okay. And I'm sure you have some angle in all this. Give us a little flavor of what are you trying to accomplish?
In our views, it's very hard when it comes to European politics because there are the ones in Europe who are trying to focus more on strong nations and having an alliance of strong nations, and there are others who have more of a globalist view. Our center mainly focuses on strengthening the nation states, and also we put a huge emphasis on sovereignty and the role of sovereignty as Hungarians within the European Union.
Understood. Yes, again, I've obviously being European-born myself and having, as I grew up with the whole process of the enlargement of the European Union and all the various phases that it had, and of course having followed evolutions over the decades, I can see that there is a room for many views, discordant views as well. If we go back in history, tell me if you agree or not, at the very, very beginning of the process, there was this maybe a bit lofty and somewhat dreamy ideas of a federal Europe, right? Which came out of the ashes of World War II, the idea we're all brothers and sisters, let's not repeat another war, let's all create a federation, a bit like the United States,
yes,
quite frankly.
exactly.
Maybe that was not the model exactly, but something akin to that. And then, as you say, there are other views about, keeping strong national foundations and having this as an association of sovereign states. And the result is a little bit of everything, it seems to me, right? Do you agree? I mean, and quite frankly, a bit of confusion as to where is this thing going and what is the consensus regarding European public opinion as to what this thing is and what it should be.
I'm not sure that there's one single person who would be confident enough to say that they understand 100% what the European Union is or how it works. What I find interesting is that the slogan of the European Union is unity in diversity. However, what I see today is that sometimes people who are working in Brussels and who are all in this bubble just don't see why nations, as sovereign nations who are diverse from each other, could strongly work together. So what I don't see is exactly the unity. Of course, there is a diversity because every nation state is different, but I think it's not a problem to be different. It's okay if we can cohabitate next to each other and work together for the strong alliance that we call the European Union.
Again, just to press this a little further, where things get complicated and controversial is, of course, when the European Union sort of not only enlarged its ranks, which of course includes Hungary, your country. Maybe you can elaborate on that a little bit later. But then we have, how can I say, maybe conflicting messages of, on the one hand, preserving national identities, but then we're saying, no, we're all in the same family, anybody can relocate within Europe and can do this and that, and free movement of people, right? And that didn't go, I mean, some countries maybe that's not very controversial. In other countries it is very controversial. And so there is and quite frankly, the whole business of Brexit, of Britain wanting out of this, in some measure, is due to the popular resistance to the notion that there's a kind of an open door, and that anybody from within the European Union can freely come and relocate. There is a mutual recognition of degrees and professional ability, whatever that is. And at some point there was the whole talk in London about the Polish plumbers, I think it was, so who are taking away jobs. You know the whole story. So here it seems to me that there is this almost schizophrenic situation right now, whereby there are some that says, oh, we need more Europe, whatever that is, and those, and perhaps you can elaborate from your perspective, your national perspective, who say, not really. It's okay to have an association among states as long as everybody maintains their independence and sovereignty. First of all, how do you see all this, and where do you think we're going?
You've mentioned the phrase that we're all just one family, like the European Union. I think it's a nice picture, but for this we need something that is called integration. Something that has been very problematic in the past few years or decades, I would say. You mentioned England. In England, the problem is that not that people go in there. The problem is that they do not integrate into the British society. They have their own communities. They don't learn the language, and they just get segregated from the society because they don't know how to contribute to that. Ever since the migration crisis rose, I think we could say in 2015, there were very different reactions from very different politicians and nations. There were those who said, like Hungary and most of the Central European countries, that this whole process should be very close. That we shouldn't just let anyone come in just like that. We should have a process. We should select. It should be a selective process, just like in Australia. I've spoken to the previous Minister of Foreign Affairs of Australia, Alexander Downer, and he told me how they had this whole selection process. Point system, exactly, because it's not about, of course, Hungary is not like an enemy of anyone. We would let in people in our country if they would, fulfill some of the requirements that I think it is fair to set against, not against, but set for the people.
I mean, I guess there are two different types of migrations. There's a migration from within the European Union, which is also controversial, and then the migration you are referring to now of people coming from outside the European Union, be it the Middle East or North Africa or other places, right? These are...
maybe the word migration is not even the best word, because migration would mean going to one place and then going back to the place where it came from. But what we see today in Europe is that we have people coming from Africa, from the Middle East, but they never go back. So maybe we shouldn't even use the word migration, but immigration, because that's what it means to leave one place in order to go to another.
Yes. So that's controversial. But let me ask you something else. I mean, the idea of the European Union was to, if we go back to the origins, was economic integration,
exactly.
Right? That's really, if we go to the roots, that economic integration, which was believed at the time, there could be also an antidote for war, against war,
yes,
right?
It's very interesting when it comes to international institutions like the UN or the EU, that the aim was not to have wars again. And of course, this had to mean that countries had to deal with their own economies. The one economy, for example, Germany, shouldn't be like twice the size as every other country. But what we see today is exactly the process of kind of not going into another war, but kind of establishing grounds for having even more conflicts. So this was not the aim of creating the European Union, that's for sure.
All right. But so how, from your vantage point, and maybe from a Central European vantage point, keeping in mind, as I'm sure you, as you know, in Washington, when people talk about Europe and ask for ask people to express themselves, usually ask whether it's a French person or a German.
Yes.
These are the people who speak for Europe, right?
Yes.
Because they're the biggest, most important
Most dominant,
states, dominant,
probably.
elements of continental Europe. If we're lucky, we may hear from a Scandinavian, maybe a Dutch or somebody. The rest, it's
I think this picture actually changed after the recent European parliamentary elections, because what we see is that Central European countries, especially the V4 alliance, is gaining more power and more influence within the EU and within the European Parliament.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be very interesting to see in the future this shift
first of all,
of powers.
explain what the V4 is, because that's, I'm sure most people
V4
don't know about it.
is an alliance that goes back hundreds of years. It's a political alliance between Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia.
Okay, and they can have a kind of a common voice on issues.
I think they can represent a unity within Europe and within Central Europe. Then there were lots of issues. For example, migration is one of them, where the V4 could have an agreement, or the recent election of Ursula von der Leyen has also been an event where the V4 connected their forces, expressed their opinions, and what we see from the results is that the V4 vote counted when it came to electing her.
Let's talk about this for a moment, because I as I mentioned at the beginning, there's been some changes which are, necessary changes because of the way the European institutions are run. And so, again, perhaps you can also elaborate a little bit, because not many people fully understand the competencies and the jurisdiction of the European Commission, which is the executive body running the European Union, which, however, it's not a government, right?
Yeah.
And so we know that because of terms, expiring, there was a decision, making process, which is kind of a little messy, which led to the nomination of a new, let's call it chief executive, president, and also in parallel other important position, which includes the head of the central bank, right, which will come from here, from Washington, the current managing director of the International Monetary Fund, the French lady, who's been at the fund now for some time, and she will be the new head, most likely, of the European Central Bank, plus other positions, the head of the foreign policy establishment, which is a title which is so complicated that I never remember it. And then there's another one, right? Isn't there a fourth?
What do you mean? The top jobs?
Yes, because you got the president of the commission.
President of the council. Also.
Yes, of course. Absolutely. The president of the council, which is sort of the gathering body of the heads of state.
Former Belgian prime minister.
Exactly. Thank you for that. Yes. So, in other words, without getting into the weeds of the specifics, does this really matter very much? In other words, who is in charge of these top positions within Europe, considering that Europe is not a state, right? Let's make that clear. It's not a state. It's not a federation. It is this sort of aggregate of countries run by a number of intergovernmental, arrangements. Does this matter? Should people say, that's really important. Who's in charge now? Oh, yes, there's going to be a change of policy, or not really?
I think it does matter, and I think it sends a very strong message that the president of the European Council is a German. Because the last time the European Council had a German president was 50 years ago. And Germany already has a huge influence.
You mean the Commission?
The Commission, yes. It was 50 years ago when the Commission had a German president. And Germany already has a huge influence within Europe, economic power, people in top jobs. And I think it does matter because, for example, when it comes to Ursula von der Leyen, she was not a very successful politician in Germany. She was the defense minister of Angela Merkel since 2013, and there is actually investigation going on against her at the moment because there were some allegations of mismanagement within the Ministry of Defense in Germany. So this is kind of a new chance for her to represent Germany and the German power from the seat of the European Commission. But the European Commission itself, as you said, it should be an executive branch, and also, as we would say, is the guard of the treaties, the bodyguard of the treaties, if you want. And what we have seen from the Juncker administration is that they were openly a political body. The Commission should not be a political body. It should be an executive power and the guard of the treaty. So we will see what von der Leyen thinks about this.
Okay, so you think there may be changes there. Okay, talk about for a moment about the I guess it's a Spaniard, right, who's going to be in charge of foreign policy,
yes.
Correct? Again, this, I know, especially for our audience, this may be very, very confusing because we know that each country has its own government, and of course each government has its own foreign minister and minister of defense and what have you, and its own foreign policy with its own ambassadors, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, even here in Washington, if you go not too far from here, there is a delegation of the European Commission, the European Union, which is something like you say, oh, is that the Embassy of Europe? Well, I mean, yes and no, right? It's it's an office that has full diplomatic credentials that represent the executive body of Europe here in Washington. On the other hand, each individual member of the European Union has its own embassy. And now we have this complicated thing of ambassadors, ministers from each country, plus a commissioner that deals with foreign affairs, plus now, as of a few years, this high representative for foreign and security, I guess, also.
Yes. Federica Mogherini was the previous one, yes.
Yes, so this Italian lady who was the incumbent, now her term expired, and now we have this Spaniard who is going to... What does all this mean? In other words, does Europe have a foreign policy? Is there a foreign policy of Europe?
I think it sends a very strong message that all the people that you just talked about who fill these top jobs are all considered Western Europeans. So there isn't a lot of people from Central or Eastern Europe filling these top jobs. And I think it also sends a message that these Western European people are in
charge. Yeah.
Yes, in charge.
But that said, what do they represent really beyond themselves? I mean, if they go and negotiate something, are they can commit everybody, all the 27 now, or soon to be 27 members of the European Union are committed because somebody goes someplace and signs something and that speaks on behalf of the entirety of Europe?
People who are in those positions tend to think that. However, I think it should not be like that. But for example, I think as president of the European Council, von der Leyen had to get absolute majority vote from all the 751 MEPs. So I think that's a huge political legitimacy, I would say, that she had to win. And she did not win with a lot. It was 383, just 9 votes more than the absolute majority. So the question, I think, rather is that would she be able to fulfill her promises that she made with such little backing?
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So this is about, again, this is kind of just a broad brush, trying to understand the fact that we have this hybrid, if I can use this expression, of this agglomeration, let's say, of countries into this union, where the term union is really misleading because it's not a political union, even though it is in its aspirations, the Europeans say, oh, we're going to have more union later, okay? But nobody decided what this union is, what its contours and content are going to be, and how this union will work with the member states.
Another thing is that, they usually refer to the European values. I think that's another very interesting term, and no one can explain what it means. Because, for example, when they are doing investigations against Hungary, for example, at the moment, they are referring to, Hungary is not okay with the European values. What are the European values, and who says what are the European values? Who decides?
Who defined them?
Who defines them?
Is there a charter of European values?
Exactly, and are the European values above national values that a nation defines itself?
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting, a lot, as I can see, that creates a possible divergent interpretations as to how this is going to happen. But let me ask you something else. I mean, again, obviously, especially if we look at it from here, from Washington, Europe is usually taken into account as a major economic and trade power. Again, at least the aggregate. And say, oh, the Europeans are going to do this, the Europeans are going to do that, the European Union is moving in this way or that way, etc. My perspective, interested in hearing yours, is that for whatever reasons, Europe is not firing on all cylinders, meaning the European economies in the aggregate are doing barely okay, meaning we're talking about a rate of growth in Europe, if we're talking the European Union and even the more narrower Eurozone, right, where the countries that have adopted the common currency, where there's a rate of growth of about 1% on a good day.
Not in Hungary, because it was 5.4.
Oh, there you go.
Yes.
Okay, that's something to talk about then. But if you look at Germany, or let alone Italy,
yeah, that
I
was
think
lower. Yes.
it's probably zero. Why is that? I mean, we would like to think here in the United States that there is more oxygen, so to speak, for the economy because of a more kind of a relaxed regulatory environment, more room for free enterprise, for formation of capital, more competition, maybe, movement, within the United States, and all that. In other words, that this is at the source of vitality, availability of investment capital, et cetera, et cetera. What's happening? Why do you think, what's your view, and then you can talk about the specifics of Hungary, why do you think that overall Europe is so sluggish? What's happening there?
You know what I think here from Washington seems like a decline. I would not describe it as a decline, but as a shift in powers. So this is a phase when I think the whole market in the European Union and in all the member states is being transformed. What we see is that, for example, at the first quarter of this year, 4 out of 5 of the European Union's countries who had the biggest development in their economy, it was Central European countries. So what we have seen in the past, let's say, few years or decades, is that, of course, the Western European countries were the ones with the strongest economy. But what we see today, for example, in Hungary, where we had 5.4% of GDP growth in the past quarter year, I think it's not a decline, it's just the transition or transform of the powers, the economic powers within Europe.
But what are, in the case of Hungary, which you know very well, what are the drivers of economic growth now in Hungary? What are the sectors of the economy that are really chugging very well and that produce higher rates of growth, in your judgment?
Hungary is a great country, I think, to come and settle in and have a business. It's just a great place for investment because we have quality workforce. I think the conditions in which the workers work there is extremely good, especially on a European scale. So I think it is the investment that takes place in Hungary, a lot of by the United States, is one factor that makes the economic growth thrive.
I heard, again, that there's a certain special care in Hungary in education.
Yes.
Maybe you can elaborate on that, because, again, as a student of economy and having worked in many parts of the world, I realize more and more that a key component of any development or growth policy has to be human capital, right?
Yes.
And the better educated your workforce is, the better your chances of obtaining, of luring in and obtaining quality investments, because investors, especially in this competitive high technology world, want quality people. And they don't want to start from zero saying, okay, we have to train everybody. Is that a factor in the case of Hungary? Is that a deliberate policy to take care of human capital and education?
Absolutely. And what we see is that, there was this time when people went abroad to study abroad and they just got stuck there and didn't come home. But I think that's not the case anymore. So I see lots of young people within my environment who go to abroad, study there, gain as many knowledge as possible, and they bring it back. And it's really good to see that they bring it back to Hungary and let it flourish there. Also, what I think is great is that universities give place and support to startups. startups in Hungary, the startup culture in Hungary, I think it is thriving at the moment, and it's very promising to see how these young people with their excellent ideas just have the platform and all the support to make these great businesses. One friend of mine, for example, just started her startup when she was, I think, maybe 16. It was her father who had to sign the first contract of hers because she wasn't even 18, and now it's a thriving startup.
Well, tell me, that's very interesting because again, this looks a bit like America, quite frankly. Sounds
We're
like
trying.
No, but that's. And I'm not saying. I guess imitation is whatever, flattery, whatever the analogy is. But so are these universities that support startups? Are these private universities or public universities or both?
Most
How
of
does
the
that work?
universities in Hungary are public. I would say there's a very few private universities.
Okay, but that's even more interesting. It means that the government has the foresight to understand the need to nurture new companies in the private sector.
I think it was in the past few weeks that our Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade, Peter Sziarto, signed a contract with I think an American company or not just a company, the American governmental body, that we should have more exchange students between America and Hungary. The very fact that I am here, that I have a research fellowship, so I can be here for 6 months and study and bring back all the knowledge I have to Hungary. The Erasmus program that we have, I think one of the strongest and most powerful things we have in Hungarian university is the Erasmus program, because people get the chance to go to abroad, study there for half a year, gain as many experiences and as many knowledge as possible, and bring it back and let it flourish in our home country.
Yeah, so to explain to everybody, the Erasmus program is within Europe, right?
Yes.
It's a kind of a system of student exchanges among universities.
Yes.
Within Europe.
Yes,
Unfortunately,
exactly.
it doesn't apply here, I don't think.
No, it's within Europe.
Because the United States is not a member of this.
Yes.
But so, startups, okay, that's pretty good. So basically, we're beginning to identify something here. We're talking about concern and focus on quality higher education, supporting the creation of new enterprises. What about, the regulatory environment in Hungary and the laws and the taxation? I mean, would you describe Hungary in general as a pro-business environment?
Absolutely. I think just the presence of lots of, for example, German car manufacturing companies is a great proof of that.
Because again, looking at other parts of Europe, I wouldn't make the same assessment in terms of having the appropriate, ecosystem, if you wish, that favors the creation of enterprises, heavy taxation, a huge burden of the public sector, and enormous public debt at least in some countries, not all of them. But I come from Italy, so I know a thing or two about fiscal mismanagement, which I have to say, I left decades ago and hasn't improved much since. In fact, if anything, has been steadily going worse. But even if you look at Spain or let alone Greece, of course,
Greece, yes.
and even France, it's rather worrisome. So in other words, would you say that if the rest of Europe would adopt sort of the Hungarian formula in terms of favoring economic development, growth, and investments, there would be a more dynamic environment? Do you think all countries are kind of suitable for following this example?
Being a Hungarian, it's very hard talking about this because, of course, I love my country. So it would be easy to say, just be like Hungary. But we have seen Western European countries adopting our policies, for example, on migration. So maybe I don't think that there wouldn't be a way for them to adapt our economic growth.
All right. But overall, do you see now, especially since there's this shift now with a new chief executive, a new president of the commission, new head of the central bank, and everybody else, just getting installed, so to speak, do you see a new, that these people with their own, constituencies and what have you, are working towards some kind of a new plan? Do you see a new new milestones for Europe from their own perspective, whether you like them or not. Do you see that this, or are we going to do more or less plodding along and do pretty much the same thing and trying to kind of survive day to day? What's your take?
I think it was very interesting to listen to von der Leyen's speech after she got elected, because she promised something to everybody. So she promised, as for the Greens, that she wants to achieve that Europe should be the very first entity in the world who should fight against climate change and reach being neutral when it comes to climate change by 2050. She promised, border protection when it comes to migration. So she promised something to everybody. Of course, the full gender balanced commission, that was another very interesting to hear from her. So if she would fulfill all of the promises, that would be huge controversy. So I think she would have to decide which parties or which sides would she prefer.
In other words, you don't see at the moment clear priorities.
No, I think no one.
This is kind of a general supermarket thing where you can.
Yes, she promised something to everybody, and what's interesting to see is that it was rather the center or right affiliated MEPs who elected her. We see it from numbers. However, she made lots of promises to the liberals and to those who are on the left. So we will see.
Talking about climate change and all this stuff, which in Europe is really a big deal, as you know, here in the United States, it's more of a mixed bag, right? To say the least. There is no consensus. From a national perspective and from a European perspective, how do you see this? In other words, are the focus on shifting energy sources, sometimes in very unproductive ways, the way I see it? Is it well advised? In other words, to say, we got to move away from fossil fuels because they're bad, let's all go to, the good stuff, the renewables, the solar and the wind. I mean, we've seen in Germany this sort of odd thing of pushing hard on solar energy in a country which is not really very suitable. It's not too much sun in Germany. Now, it's parts of it, yes, but not everywhere. And so as a result, you see, very high cost electricity without, frankly, too much gain on the lowered emission side. No, it's just one example. But do you see this as something that can help economic growth while trying to do something for the environment? Or is this just sloganeering and trying to please the Greens and the environmentalists to say, let's condemn everything, all fossil fuels are bad, let's move away from them because they're the devil, and let's do this new stuff, which at the moment is very expensive. How do you see it? And I don't know, from a national policy standpoint, where does Hungary sit on any of this?
As a previous youth delegate of Hungary to the United Nations that deals a lot with sustainable development, I have to say that I believe in living sustainably and sustaining our planet for future generations. However, this does not mean that we can just convert to renewables from one moment to another. Especially from a Hungarian point of view, we think that we should do this conversion to renewables while at the same time preserving, for example, the nuclear energy that we have, because it helps us a lot. That's something that we have and that we can use. When it comes to this whole energy policy or security policy, I think the two of them are closely connected. I think it's always important to see the geographical position of the countries that we're talking about. As for Hungary, we are landlocked in this rather Eastern European, Central Eastern European position that we are in. And of course, it's very easy to say that, you're too dependent on Russia. For the moment, it is Russia that we have the gas supply from, and we would love to see, for example, the LNG terminals from Kirk, from Croatia, being
developed.
Just being established at least, so that there could be an LNG terminal where we could get gas from. So I think it's always interesting to see the whole picture and just to take a look at the map where these countries really are and who they are dependent on.
Yeah, let's clarify this just to expand a little bit. for those, in our audience who may not be familiar with the whole business of energy supplies to Europe, because of history and geography and location of major gas fields in Russia, Europe, in particular Eastern Europe, has been largely dependent on Russian supplies, and I guess this applies to Hungary as well. And of course, that presents concerns because, of course, this is an economic transaction, but also has geopolitical implications.
And sometimes political, too.
Yes, of course, of dependence on a major supplier who may not have our best interest at heart, that being Russia. Nowadays, the market is becoming more interesting, in some measure, modest, but not insignificant, also because the United States has become a net exporter of LNG, that is liquefied natural gas, to Europe. Modest, but not insignificant, and it changes the equation a little bit, in particular for your neighbors to the north and the Baltic countries, whether it's Poland or Lithuania, etc. But you mentioned, interestingly enough, and again, for those of you who are not totally familiar with the geography, if you look at a map, you will see that the top of the Adriatic Sea, you've got Italy and bordering with Croatia, and yes, if there would be a plant that could regasify imported liquefied gas in Croatia, that's not too far from Hungary,
Quite
and then
close,
you could have pipelines. I mean, I don't know, maybe they already exist or they could be built or expanded, and that could become an alternative supply to Hungary. And again, everything else being equal, gas, while not perfect, is a lot cleaner than coal, which many countries still rely upon. But so overall, if you look at the politics of Europe, in this rather complex, if not confusing, environment of different countries, different priorities. You mentioned the new chief executive trying to give something to everybody.
Exactly.
Do you, again, what is your feeling? And given the position of Hungary in the center and the eastern part of the Union and its cooperation with other countries, where is all this going? In other words, is there something that you can say, oh, Europe is headed in this direction, or is it not headed anywhere in particular?
I think after the past few weeks, no one would dare to say that Europe is headed like in this or that particular direction. We have seen Ursula von der Leyen appearing on the European Union scene.
The new president of the Commission.
Yes,
right?
And after 2 weeks, she's elected. No one saw that coming. I think we can say that for sure. Lots of so-called traditional practices, for example, have been broken down. The Spitzencandidate system, or as you would call it, the lead candidate system, is failed. Neither Weber nor Timmermans were able to present a plan for the heads of the governments in the European Union. They did not elect them. Of course, Weber said these things like, I don't want the vote of Hungarians. Well, he didn't get them. Von der Leyen wanted them. She got them. She got elected as president. But I think what we could say about the future is that they're absolutely uncertain. There's uncertainty everywhere. Even on the political agenda, we don't know what von der Leyen will do in the future, but even touching up on our previous topic, the energy security. Because what we know is that there's a contract between Russia and Ukraine that will expire by the end of this year, and no one knows what's coming after. So what
and
we
Nord Stream 2 is coming
And Nord
up.
Stream 2, yes. I don't think it will be established by the end of this year, but however, it's still on the way. And coming from Russia and ending up in Germany is something that, again, sends a very strong message that Germany, who is already above all the other European countries, would gain even more power because it will be the one distributing the gas coming from Nord Stream 2.
They don't need that gas. Yes, they'll distribute it. But okay, let's try to put all this together in a if we can, in a semi-coherent fashion. So we've got, let's say, broadly speaking, issues of economic growth, right? Which, you provided interesting points about the components, the drivers of Hungarian growth, which I compliment your government, society, everybody of focusing, it seems to me, at least on some of the right things that are conducive to economic growth.
Thank you.
And whereas the rest of Europe, not so great overall. So there is also the role of Europe as a international trading bloc, right?
Yes, exactly.
Which is not insignificant.
No, not
Probably
at all.
the largest in the world, in the aggregate.
It's great to see that America has recognized this, because I
Yes.
think for a very long time America looked in Europe as a thing to deal with. But what we see, I think, in the past few years is that America is starting to recognize Europe as an ally, and I think it's a very important step.
On the other hand, several years ago, as I'm sure you know, there was this big idea of this free trade agreement, right, between the United States and the European Union, and it hasn't really gone anywhere, right?
Yes.
There's too many. Something that, because it was not so much an agreement about reducing tariffs, which are very low anyway, that's not really, but about harmonizing practices and rules and standards, especially in the services industry, in
Yes.
banking and other, which would have allowed larger, it seems to me, flows, right, of interaction between the two sides of the Atlantic. Unfortunately, that has not really progressed much.
No, not really.
And even now, when it comes to trade issues, whether it's the imports of automobiles or what have you, something is underway, but not, I don't see any breakthroughs, at least that I can detect at the moment. And now with the changing of the guard in Brussels, maybe there will be additional delays and procedures and whatnot.
Or a new direction.
That's right. But where, in other words, Europe used to stand for, I guess, free trade, at least, right? Do you see that changing, or is that a feature that would be a defender, so to speak, of a free trading system, a rules-based system focused on the WTO, the World Trade Organization?
I would say the latter.
Yes,
Yeah.
we'll continue.
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
that will continue. And then let's circle back to what we were talking earlier, which is so controversial in Europe, which is migration,
Yes.
or positive immigration, as you pointed out. In other words, certainly, again, I've seen in the Mediterranean side of Europe for years, it was kind of completely unchecked, and and this goes way back. In other words, way before the crisis that came out of the civil war in Syria.
Yes.
Since I would say even the late 80s and 90s, there's been this steady immigration of people coming mostly from Africa, both North Africa as well as Sub-Saharan Africa, people who would trek across the Sahara Desert and then put themselves in the hands of God knows who and try to make the crossing, mostly to Italy because of the proximity, right?
Yes.
The geography. And that now we see a backlash. I mean, certainly, and perhaps you can speak to that. Many European segments, so to speak, of European societies express their displeasure about this unchecked immigration from outside the European Union through the formation or the rise of nationalistic, some say xenophobic, anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, anti-whatever parties. Tell us about this, because again, Hungary also has his own, view on all this, right?
I think we can say that, yes.
So I'm just trying to be cautious here, what I'm saying. So tell us your view, and is this immigration going to continue unabated? What's going to happen? And first of all, what has already happened in your view?
A lot of people wonder why could Fidesz reach a 52% majority in the past European parliamentary elections. And I think one word describes it very well, and it's consistency. Because when the whole crisis of migration erupted, there were lots of Western European politicians, for example, Angela Merkel, who said, "Willkommens Kultur. Everyone is welcome. Just come in and we will see what happens. We will provide you with anything, and we won't give you, you won't have to go through any process."
And this was about 1 million people, right?
This was not just like 10 or 20 people. We're talking about millions of people. Yes, thank you for pointing that out because it's very important. And what we see is that these politicians starting to recognize that maybe this was not the best of the ideas that they had, and now they are shifting towards more of the Eastern European, or let's say the Hungarian point of view. But the Hungarian point of view is that we should take help to the places where it is needed and not bring the problem to Europe, because the Hungarian government thinks that it's more effective to help on field where there's the problem rather than bringing the problem to Europe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course. And having worked a lot, this is my own personal experience and background in emerging countries, especially in Africa, I can tell you that the effort of improving circumstances there has been conducted rather unsuccessfully for half a century. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I'm not saying that's the wrong idea. Unfortunately, we've not been effective.
No, not at all. There are lots of ways and space for improvement. Yeah. But, you know, another thing is that we should not ignore the existence of different cultures.
Yes.
So the policy that the West has been doing, Western European have been doing for a long time, is that bringing in cultures, very different cultures from the European one, and just there are two cultures that just can't live together, and you know, after a while one would dominate the other. And as we, for example, Hungarians, said that we don't want this to happen in Hungary. We want to preserve our own cultures, our own identity, and if someone wants to come to our country and respects that, we're okay with that.
Yeah, okay, which is a different basically you want to stress your national identity, I suppose, and your history and culture. Yes,
but national is a very dangerous word today. Yes. I think it commonly gets confused with nationalism. It gets confused with imperialism, I think.
With aggressive. Being aggressive. Yes. But you want to preserve your own national patrimony, and you think that people who come in should embrace that.
That's true.
Essentially, yes. You see, here in the United States, of course, it's a little different, because the United States, having a completely different history, not being a nation state, but you know, everybody says that we're a country of immigrants. However, if I may say so, being an immigrant myself, there was a strong patrimony, whether this is still acknowledged or not, which is the civic culture of America.
Yes.
America is founded on strong principles of values and organization and the function of the state, etc. And the idea was at the time, at the beginning of the United States, that anybody, regardless of where they're coming from, if they sign up to this, they look at the fine print, and they say, okay, I'm okay with that, well, then you're welcome.
Yeah, there are lots of similarities, I think, between the US and Hungary. Because, for example, I think the role of, for example, God in the establishment of the nations, I think it's very interesting, because if we think back, to the establishment of America, all the founding fathers thought that the power that they got, it was from God. For our Constitution starts with the word God. So I think it's very interesting to see how both America and Hungary believe that the power that the politicians gain, it is from God to govern the people.
Yeah. Of course, our Constitution doesn't mention God. The Declaration of Independence does, but which is it's a political document, not a legal document. But anyway, do you see that now going forward, considering that these pressures from poor countries to try to get to rich countries, let's be blunt about this, the pressures will continue.
Yes,
poverty continues to exist.
Yes.
Africa has more than 1 billion people. The fertility rate is fairly high.
Yes.
And the ability of those societies to provide for their people, inadequate as they are today, they're not going to be any significantly better tomorrow. So the pressure will continue. Do you see, from your perspective, Europe being able to agree on a policy of that will regulate in a meaningful way migration, or rather immigration from outside the European Union, in a way that is not destabilizing?
Honestly, I don't see this happening at the moment or in the near future. This is a fact that this pressure will continue. That's what we see. The population of Africa will grow. I think the difference is in which type of answer nations give to this problem. So, for example, we as Hungarians, we have very strong family supporting policies because we want our fertility rate, which has decreased in the past 30 years, to finally increase. But there are some Western European countries who think that the declining fertility rate could be solved with just having people come to Europe.
Migration, yes. Which is, again, and I look, Italy, as I said, because having been the target of migration and also being one of the European countries with the lowest fertility rates, yes, some people say exactly that. Oh, no problem. You replace the Italians with the immigrants, which would be great if the immigrants could integrate fully and participate in the society like everybody else and learn the language and be skilled and subscribe to everything that they should. Well, then I wouldn't see any problem. But integration is really, really tough.
Key. Yes.
Going further, there's been talk recently about Europe finding a stronger common ground, not just on foreign policy, but also on security issues. In other words, that Europe should have its own, I guess, security arrangement, which ultimately means its own armed forces, right? Yeah, can't do that. Can't talk about policies without tools. Of course, as we both know, Europe has been, tied since the end of World War II, the beginning of the Cold War, to the United States under the NATO alliance.
Under the NATO, yes.
The NATO alliance. And that's still pretty much what it is today, even though NATO has reduced its profile, has enlarged its membership, including Hungary, but certainly lowered its profile in terms of its commitments to armaments and what have you. Now, is that, this thing which has been discussed mainly in France, President Macron seems to be the one who's pushed this, trying to find a consensus between Paris and Berlin mostly on this. Is this going anywhere? Is this just talk? Or do you see that Europe will have the, the vision, the ability to coordinate, and quite frankly, the willingness to spend the money necessary to create European forces that would give some credibility to whatever policy pronouncements may come out of Brussels on security? Do you see that? Is this for real, or is it just blah, blah?
I think it's usually just talk from the Western European politicians, and the reason why I say that is because when we Hungarians, built the border, border protection wall on our border, we got criticized for it, and we did not support any financial support. We did not receive any financial support for that. So I think if it wasn't just talk, then at least they wouldn't have criticized us for that that much. When it comes to NATO alliance, I think in the past years what we have seen is that America, the question America raises is what can Europe bring to the table, or what can Hungary bring to the table. But I'm very glad to see that these days America starts to recognize that it's not just Europe who has to contribute to the NATO alliance, but it is also America who has to take into consideration Europe as an ally and not just as a factor.
Again, do you think, from your perspective, that NATO still has a purpose? In other words, NATO, as we know, was created because there was the Soviet Union and you represented a threat. You lived not only under the threat and suffered in the Hungarian uprising.
Yes.
In an attempt to get rid of the Soviet Union, which unfortunately didn't work out so well, and there was major repression.
Yes.
You know all this stuff.
1956.
1956, and then, of course, the whole thing mercifully collapsed. But now, in this new world, after the Soviet Union, and the fact that countries of Eastern Europe, including Hungary, managed to regain their sovereignty and become, full participants in the international community and make their own choices, including joining the EU, including joining NATO. But if we look forward, forward, what's the mission of a common security arrangement linking United States and Canada to most of Europe once the main threat, that is the Soviet Union, is gone? Even though you can say, oh, but Russia out there, you know, the Russians are still problematic and difficult customers. What's your perspective, especially since you're right there, kind of in a, let's say, semi-border area between
Yes.
West and East? What's your reading on all this? Do you think it still has a function, the NATO alliance?
As you said, NATO was established after wars that we won't have anymore. So I think the role that NATO plays now is that since we do not have that big wars going on at the moment, thank God, the reason of the existence of NATO at the moment is prevention, so that we won't have to deal with wars in the future. And I know this is going to sound very cheesy, but there's this quote when it comes to, I think it was Secretary General of the United Nations who said that the UN was not created to take mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell. And I think in some regard it applies to NATO too. It is there. We have a security alliance. And even if it does not do that significant of a job at the moment, we know that it is there and we can reach back to it whenever needed. Hopefully it won't be needed, but if we need it, it will be there and we would be able to count on it.
Who's threatening Europe, from your perspective? Who's threatening Europe right now? I mean, or now, or in a possible...
Europeans.
Well, that would not be very good then. You know, if the main threat is from within, if you think about an outside threat to the security of Europe, the European Union, as well as the NATO members, where does that threat come? Is it a resurgent Russia? Is it Iran? Is it terrorism? In other words, what are the security challenges that you can say, oh boy, that's really potentially an issue? What could that be from your perspective?
Fortunately, terrorism, I think, hasn't been that much of an issue in Europe. Of course, there were these very sad and terrible events, but it's not a trend. So, thankfully. But I think when it comes to security challenges coming from outside, I must say Russia, because you know what we have seen, the disinformation strategies, causing chaos within America or Europe as a strategy. I think that is kind of the threat that we should not be afraid of, but prepared to face.
So Russia is still problematic?
I would say yes.
All right. Well, okay, let's all be ready then. Let's all work together on this. Well, on this note, I think we can wrap it up. And thank you so much, Zsofia, for being with us. We've been talking about Europe, back and forth on all kinds of different things: economy, nationalism, migration, foreign policy, with Zsofia Racz, who is Hungarian and an analyst with the Budapest-based Center for Fundamental Rights. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.